सेव किया था ना?
मैं सिर्फ इसलिए गया था क्योंकि उसने मुझे कॉल किया, that's it. But listen तो.
Save it for someone else.
जिंदगी में सेव करना जरूरी है, मगर जब बात पैसों की हो, सिर्फ सेविंग से काम नहीं चलेगा। इक्विटी म्यूचुअल फंड्स में इन्वेस्ट कीजिए और अपने सेविंग्स को आगे बढ़ने का मौका दीजिए।
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme-related documents carefully.
For several macro sutras now, we've been talking about what the budget can do, what it should do. But now the budget is done. And so in this edition of Macro Sutra, we're going to look at what the big hits and misses are in Budget 2023. I'm TCA Sharad Raghavan, Deputy Editor at ThePrint, and we have with us Radhika Pandey, Senior Fellow at NIPFP. Thank you so much, Radhika, for joining us once again.
Thanks, Sharad.
So now, Radhika, there's a lot that this budget did seem to get right, but let's start with the one thing that even the FM in her speech said that everybody was waiting for, which are the personal income tax changes. Now, I know yesterday in the post-budget live that we did, we could only go over the broad strokes of what were done because there was not any real clarity on what the details were of the changes that were made. But now we have those details. So could you tell us a little more about the changes that she's made in the personal income tax?
Yes, so primarily in the new taxation regime, the FM has made changes. So there are two key changes. One, that the rebate has been raised from rupees 5 lakh to rupees 7 lakh. Okay. And secondly, that the tax slabs, the number of tax slabs have been reduced to 5. And also that the maximum tax rate has been reduced from 42% to 39.5%. So those are the changes that have been made in the new tax regime, primarily to help the middle class, boost consumption.
Right.
So they have more disposable income in their hands and they are able to spend more at a time when global headwinds are challenging the growth prospects of the country. So that is the key change. But what needs to be seen is that how many people are using the new taxation regime, because this was introduced in 2020.
Right.
And since then we did not see a substantive move from the old taxation regime to the new taxation regime. So a lot depends on how many people migrate from the old to the new tax regime, given that now the FM also made it clear that the new tax regime is going to be the default tax regime. Right. So going forward, if there are changes, those would be in the new tax regime rather than in the old tax regime. So there is a complete thinking around taxation and around financialization of savings that are reflected in this budget speech.
So you mentioned a few things. So one, what does it mean by making the new taxation system the default? Whereas you still have the choice to choose the old one. So what does default mean?
Default means that whatever changes will be made henceforth will be made in the new tax regime. It is a kind of signaling mechanism that the government wants people to shift to the new tax regime, because whatever relaxations will be made, they will be made to the new tax regime. In a nutshell, the government wants people to move to the new tax regime, which is devoid of all exemptions and deductions. So it is a move towards simplification, but it also depends on the discretion of the taxpayer whether she wants to move from the old to the new tax regime.
Right. So again, I had some interactions with people in the Ministry of Finance today, and what they're saying is, for at least for people who are earning up to 7 lakhs, there was a lot of feedback saying that in the old tax regime you don't pay tax till 5 lakhs, and then after that you have exemptions.
Correct.
So effectively up to 7 lakhs anyway you were not paying tax. So this increase of rebate has put these two
in parity now.
In parity.
Yes.
But on the other hand, now the new taxation regime has standard deduction as well. So that's the other parity thing. But the new tax regime has lower rates.
Yes.
So does it then mean that people at the lower end of the spectrum might actually now start benefiting more from the new taxation regime?
Yes. So I think those who are starting their professional careers and those at the lower end, they might migrate to the new tax regime. So I think this year with these substantive changes, there will be a move to the new tax regime, particularly for this section. But those whose savings are locked up in, say, housing loans, they would like to take rebates on the interest paid on housing loan. Those who have parked their their savings in instruments that are eligible for deductions under Section 80C, they would continue under the old tax regime. So there are lots of consideration. There are people who want a simplified tax regime, and they are looking at a diversified set of portfolio. They would want to invest more in equity. So there they would like to move to the new tax regime. So there are these number of consideration. But what is clear is that the government would like to push people to move to the new tax regime, which is devoid of exemption, but it's more simplified. It has lesser tax rates.
Right. So we have actually a question from one of our viewers, Aditya, which I think you just answered, but I'll ask it anyway. Do you think with the kind of tax exemptions introduced in the budget, is it getting clear that the government is pushing for a new tax regime? And do you think in the near future we might see the new tax regime completely in place of the old one?
Yes, we should see some shift from the old to the new tax regime with this kind of incentives, and given that the FM has clearly indicated that the new tax regime is going to be the default one. But again, as I indicated, it depends on the saving preferences of people. It also depends on whether we are putting our savings in insurance, whether we want to stake deductions on insurance premium. So it all depends on the savings habits of people also. There are people who may not be interested in insurance, so they would like to go for the new tax regime.
Right.
Risk-taking ability, housing loan. So a lot of things will determine the preference of one tax regime over the other.
So you mentioned about people's preferences, but there's also the side of incentives to save. The new tax regime, because it does not give any tax exemptions, people might not have as many incentives to put money in PPF, put money in insurance, put money in NPS. So is this, this surely is not a favorable turn of events, right?
Yes, so that is definitely a key takeaway from this shift, that it will not incentivize people to save in these tax saving instruments. And actually we have done some work also on this, and we've seen that people generally tend to save more in these tax saving instruments.
Right.
So it will definitely be a dampener towards household saving, but at the same time it gives more flexibility to people to invest in other options. So it needs to be seen how the savings pan out in the next couple of years when there is a substantial migration from the old to the new tax regime.
Right.
But definitely at this point in time, the indication is a disincentive towards the Section 80C kind of saving instrument, and that is why we also saw insurance shares falling yesterday, all the financial services shares, stocks declining yesterday, because there was nothing for them. So that is definitely the indication.
Not only nothing for them, but now you're disincentivizing people from taking those, right? So now Aditya has another question relating to tax. Do you think the government has missed a trick of not increasing the tax exemption limit under Section 80C? Because if it was declared, then this might move, lead to more public investment if there are more savings in these. But I think here again, as you said, the government is trying to get you away from exemption. So if it starts increasing the limit, then this undoes.
Savings are seen to be very sensitive to these tax saving instruments. They are highly responsive to these tax saving instruments. If there is an increase in limit, savings do increase. It's not that the overall level of savings increases, that there is a shift of savings towards more of tax saving instruments. So it's not that the aggregate level of savings increase. There is a substitution happening from one saving instrument to another. Just by this shift or migration from old to new tax regime, we cannot say that the savings would take a hit. There would be a change in savings composition, and that will be interesting to see in the coming years.
And now, clearly, as you can see, taxation is on everybody's mind. So we have one more question from our audience, from Vivekanand. He asks, it's a long question, but basically he's asking, is there a limit in the concessions availed for a year by an individual beyond which the new tax regime is no longer lucrative to adopt? But there are no concessions in the new tax regime. So maybe he meant in the old tax regime, the limits are 1.5 lakhs, right, under 80C?
80C, and then 50,000 for NPS, and some for the interest on housing loans. I think these are broadly, if we say 2 lakh is the exemption.
The limit. Yeah, right.
Yes.
So now, with all of these tax changes that have been made, you mentioned briefly that this will encourage consumption. Do you feel that that's something, it'll be a significant push to consumption, something like this?
It is more of a signaling mechanism, and at least at the lower end, for those people who will opt for this new tax regime, there will definitely be a mild push to consumption. And that is a positive move given all the constraints around fiscal consolidation, macro stability, elevated debt to GDP ratio. In fact, this much is also a very welcome development.
Right.
If the government would have given a big boost, then it would have led to a complete, swelling of our fiscal deficits, rise in interest payments, and going forward, it would have curtailed our consumption further. So I think it's a tightrope walk between managing macro stability considerations and giving some kind of boosters to growth. And in that context, I think the budget has ticked the right boxes.
Right. And the other major tax thing that they've done, and you had mentioned it, is for the rich. They've reduced the surcharge, so the effective tax rate has come down for the rich. Now, again, as a signaling thing, is this because they're worried that a lot of high net worth individuals were fleeing the country to tax havens?
Yes, it is a positive signal to remain here, to invest, so that people, if they have more income in their hands, they have less taxable income, they will be incentivized to invest more.
Right.
So I think that is the incentive through reducing tax rates and also reducing the number of tax slabs.
Right. And now let's move away from tax and coming to the next big thing that the budget did get right, which is capital expenditure.
Correct.
The government has said that it will invest 10 lakh crores in this year. And the economic survey said that the government is on track to meet its 7.5 lakh crore target for the last year. So such a big and ongoing capital push, do you feel that it seems to be the only engine that is firing right now, the government, because private sector hasn't really picked up yet?
So we have seen this as one of the key development agenda of the government, and this is the third consecutive year when the government has increased the capital spending.
Right.
And it is giving results. If we look at the overall investment to GDP ratio in terms of gross fixed capital formation to GDP ratio, that is showing a gradual rise, mainly due to increase in government capital spending.
Right.
And it does incentivize private sector also to start investing. And once we see a more stable regime towards taxation as well as better global environment, we should see pickup in private investment.
Okay.
There are initial signs of pickup if we look at some key indicators like announced projects, if we look at capacity utilization. These are, though there is an uneven growth trajectory, but overall there is an increase in private sector investment also. But it is being realized that government investment, the push to capex has to come from the government. But at the same time, it's also important that this amount is spent, because if we look at the revised estimates number for the current financial year, they have slashed the last year's amount by 3%.
Right.
Yeah, so from 7.5 lakh crore to 7.2 lakh crore. So administrative capacity, the ability to spend also has to increase concomitantly along with the allocation. And we've also talked about the fact that they have also incentivized states to boost their capital spending by increasing the allocation towards the 50-year interest-free loan to 1.3 lakh crore. Again, the problem is about the ability to spend, ability to spend in a limited time, prioritizing capital expenditure over revenue expenditure at a time when we have so many states elections and then general election. So those are all the challenges. But on the allocation front, I think the government has done well by increasing capital. And also the railways have got a big boost that will generate employment opportunities, and that will incentivize, because if our logistics are good, it does give incentives for private sector players also to come in.
Right. And now again, the view, I think, in the finance ministry, at least when I went and spoke to them today, was that these last 4 months of the year, they're counting from December onwards, that's likely to see the bulk of the state's capital expenditure because they usually crowd it towards the end.
Yeah.
So maybe we'll see some action there.
This is the trend seen over the last couple of years also, that only in the second half, and that too also in the fourth quarter, major expenditure happens, especially capital expenditure. But it's always good to have an even flow of planning of capital spending, because if you just allocate more towards the end, you might not able to spend the entire amount.
Right, and then if the aim is to create employment and things, then you want to create it through the year, not just in
one quarter.
In one quarter, right.
Yeah.
And now Sankalp asked us, and you were talking about whether the targets are actually being met or not. So he asked us a related question, which is, the government's focus on infra is being praised overall, but what is it ultimately culminating into? Are we simply living in hopes that these new roads, railways, bridges and ports will bring in large industries, or are there actual industrial corridors? So basically he's asking, are we seeing things on the ground?
Yeah. So yes, we are seeing in terms of industrial corridors, we are seeing new announcements. We have seen defense industrial corridors being set up in different states. We are seeing investment summits being organized by different states. We are seeing a surge in employment and capital investments increase happening in states. So I think there is a tangible benefit, but a lot, as I said, also depends on the external environment and the flow of investments from abroad. What is happening to FDI? So all of that will stabilize when the global environment and inflation stabilizes. But I think in terms of if we see a sustained rise in capex, we are seeing an improvement in industrial corridors. In fact, in terms of defense industrial corridors, we have seen an increase.
So now moving from the capex and tax, we move to the next big thing. The key takeaway from this budget has been the fact that they have stuck to their fiscal consolidation plan, that this year they have said that they'll meet their 6.4% fiscal deficit target. Next year will be 5.9%, which is quite a bit lower. And by 25-26, they will bring it down further to 4.5% or even lower. Now, based on the revenue and expenditure projections that they've made in the budget, do you think that this is a credible path?
Yeah, so a couple of points. First, let's talk about the current year. The current year, in terms of GDP, they have been able to achieve the target. They will be able to achieve the target in terms of GDP at 6.4%. Though in absolute level, there is a deviation of almost 1 trillion or rupees 1 lakh crore. But because their GDP, the denominator is big, what they targeted was 11%, and the real actual nominal GDP is 15.5%. So because the denominator is big, they are able to achieve the 6.4% of GDP. Now this comfort they will not have in the next year. So that is why for 23-24, the nominal GDP has been maintained, has been pegged at 10.5%, which seems to be a realistic target, given that there is going to be economic slowdown, both in real terms as well as in nominal terms. Keeping in line with that, we have also seen that even the tax revenue targets are quite realistic. They are conservative in terms of the, if we look at one of the indicators, gross tax revenue, the growth rate is reduced to 10.4%.
About the same as the nominal GDP growth, right?
Yes. So as compared to more than 12% in the revised estimates of the current year, 22-23. So in terms of taxation, we have seen that there is a pairing of growth rate in FY24. Though in terms of GDP, the tax to GDP ratio is kept constant at around 11%. The other part is the expenditure. Here we are seeing an expenditure compression. If we talk in terms of GDP, expenditure was around 15% in this year, 15.1%. It's been reduced to 14.9% in 23-24.
Wow.
And this expenditure compression is coming from revenue expenditure, because capital expenditure, we have seen an increase. Quality of expenditure has gone up, but on revenue expenditure, the government is targeting just 1.5% growth over the revised estimates of the current year.
Right.
Now, if we are able to achieve this, then we will be able to achieve our fiscal deficit target,
Of course.
as well as the revenue deficit target, where also we have seen a steep reduction in the target from 4.1% in the current year to 2.9% next year. So a lot depends on whether we are able to keep a lid on the revenue expenditure at 1.5% growth as compared to the previous year.
And I'm guessing a lot of that has to do with global events.
Global
If
developments,
again oil prices spike,
Yeah.
fertilizer prices spike,
yes.
food prices, then
Yes.
again your subsidy bill will go up.
So because a lot of it has to do with subsidy bill, because subsidy bill has been slashed substantially this year.
Yes.
But the other point of concern is that on some scheme there has been a reduction. Like on rural development, there has been a cut. On Manrega, there has been a cut. Now, that is again a demand-driven scheme, and if the demand remains elevated, they might have to increase the allocation.
Yes.
Now, if they increase the allocation, again, there will be a strain on fiscal deficit. So, there are a lot of ifs and buts on the fiscal front, but overall, tax revenue estimates look conservative, look realistic, in line with the nominal growth assumption, and expenditure compression is something that they have taken note of.
So now we've talked about the big hits that have happened, and there are several others that they've gone for green growth. They've done a lot for tribals. There's done quite a bit for women, but there are also some elements that were conspicuously absent.
Yes.
People were expecting some greater clarity on, say, the crypto policy.
Yes.
And so we have a question again from Aditya, which is that, why is the government not being able to come either side, that we are allowing it or we're not allowing it? And why is it not being able to provide clarity on last year's decision that we're going to tax it, but we're not going to fully, say whether it is allowed or not. So that's one thing that people are feeling that, wasn't there. But what are the other misses you feel?
The other miss is the disinvestment. If we look at the disinvestment target, that has been slashed substantially. Even the revised estimate target has been cut. So that is one thing. And the other point is that one of the main planks of government policy has been the strategic disinvestment policy.
Right.
And the finance minister in her previous budgets did talk about privatization of public sector banks.
Absolutely.
So those, there was no vision or there was no talk about privatization initiatives in the coming year. Or is the government thinking in terms of privatization? What are some big ticket entities which are going to be privatized, if yes or not? So on those items, there was no clarity. So that is one thing that was not talked about in the budget.
Right. And so there you go, actually. The hits have been the fact that through the taxation changes, there could be a boost to consumption by the public, which is something that is sorely needed for the economy. At the same time, the government has gone ahead with its capital expenditure program, which is a much needed engine of growth right now until private sector expenditure picks up. The capital expenditure by the government is also going to encourage the private sector to invest some more. The third hit, of course, is that the fiscal consolidation roadmap has been stuck to. It might be challenging next year to stick to it as well, but they've laid out clear plans for it. They've made conservative estimates on their revenue and expenditure side. So unless there's some unforeseen event, we could likely meet the target. And so that's great news. But on the misses, we have things like cryptocurrency and disinvestment, where on crypto, they didn't provide any clarity at all. And on disinvestment, well, they've talked a lot about it in the past, but no real action has happened on it so far. So that's all we have for you on the budget. Thank you so much for watching.